June 28, 2024, the day America lost face in Venezuela. Let me tell you something most people missed. On that Friday, when the Biden administration quietly lifted sanctions on Venezuela's oil sector just weeks after the Maduro regime had crushed opposition protests, jailed political opponents, and rigged yet another election, the real story wasn't about oil. It wasn't even about Venezuela. It was about the unraveling of American credibility on the world stage. And if you think this is just another foreign policy footnote, you're missing the bigger picture. I've spent 3 decades studying how great powers stumble. I've watched the Soviet Union collapse, seen America's unipolar moment peak and fade, and tracked the rise of China's quiet but relentless action. And what happened last month in Venezuela? That wasn't a policy shift. It was a surrender. Not in the military sense, though that may come later, but in the geopolitical sense. A public admission that the United States can no longer enforce its will, even in its own backyard. And once that realization sinks in, the world changes. Now, let's start with the official story. Because that's where the real deception begins. The official a humanitarian gesture with strategic benefits. Here's what they want you to believe. The Biden administration, facing rising gas prices ahead of an election and a humanitarian crisis in Venezuela, made a calculated move. By easing sanctions on Venezuela's oil sector, they argued, the U.S. could stabilize global energy markets, provide relief to Venezuelans suffering under Maduro's regime, and, crucially, create leverage for future democratic reforms. The Treasury Department's statement was careful, almost, these measures are designed to support the Venezuelan people while encouraging meaningful progress toward free and fair elections. The media played along. The New York Times ran a piece titled U.S. Eases Venezuela Sanctions in Bid to Lower Gas Prices and Aid Opposition. CNN framed it as a diplomatic gamble. Even some conservative outlets, usually skeptical of Biden's foreign policy, conceded that the move might help American drivers at the pump. The White House press secretary called it a balanced approach, a phrase so bland it practically screamed nothing to see here. And the numbers seem to back them up. Venezuela sits on the world's largest proven oil reserves. Before sanctions, it was pumping over 3 million barrels a day. By 2020, that had collapsed to under 500,000. The argument, if we let them sell oil again, global supply increases, prices drop, and Maduro, flush with cash, might finally be pressured into holding a real election. Win-win, right? But there's a problem with this narrative. Several, actually. And none of them have anything to do with helping Venezuelans or lowering gas prices. What they're not telling you. Let's start with the most obvious, that this was about democracy. The Biden administration didn't ease sanctions because Maduro suddenly saw the light. They did it because, after years of maximum pressure, the policy had failed. Spectacularly. I've been tracking this since the Trump administration first imposed sanctions in 2019. Back then, the theory was squeeze Venezuela's economy until Maduro either steps down or holds free elections. The U.S. recognized Juan Guaidó as interim president, froze Venezuelan assets, and cut off oil exports. The European Union, Canada, and even some Latin American countries followed suit. For a moment, it looked like regime change was inevitable. But here's what happened instead. Maduro didn't fall. He adapted. He turned to Russia, China, and Iran not just for political cover, but for survival. Russia sent Wagner Group mercenaries to protect oil fields. China extended billions in loans, paid back in oil. Iran shipped in gasoline and technical expertise to keep refineries running. And while the U.S. was busy sanctioning, Venezuela's oil production, though crippled, never actually stopped. It just went underground. By 2023, Venezuela was exporting over 600,000 barrels a day, mostly to China and India, through a shadow fleet of tankers that turned off their transponders and engaged in ship-to-ship transfers in the middle of the ocean. The sanctions weren't cutting off Maduro's revenue, they were just making it harder to track. And all the while, the Venezuelan people suffered. Hyperinflation, mass emigration, collapsing infrastructure. The sanctions hurt the people they were supposed to help. So when the Biden administration says this was about encouraging democratic progress, ask what progress? Maduro just held an election in 2024 that was so blatantly rigged that even the Carter Center, which usually bends over backward to avoid calling out fraud, refused to certify it. The opposition candidate, Maria Corina Machado, was barred from running. Her replacement, Edmundo Gonzalez, was allowed to campaign, but only because the regime knew it could control the outcome. And now, with sanctions lifted, Maduro has even less incentive to negotiate. Then there's the oil argument. The White House claims this will lower gas prices. But let's look at the numbers. Venezuela's current production is around 800,000 barrels a day. Even if they ramp up to 1.2 million by the end of the year, which is optimistic, that's a drop in the bucket compared to global demand of over 100 million barrels a day. The real beneficiaries? China and India, who will buy Venezuelan oil at a discount, refine it, and sell it back to the world, including the US, at market prices. Meanwhile, American refiners in the Gulf Coast, who used to process Venezuelan heavy crude, are now stuck paying more for Canadian or Middle Eastern oil. So if this wasn't about democracy or gas prices, what was it really about? Desperation and geopolitics. First, desperation. The Biden administration is staring down an election where inflation and energy prices are top voter concerns. They've already drained the strategic petroleum reserve to historic lows. They've begged Saudi Arabia to pump more oil, only to be rebuffed. They've watched as Iran, another sanctioned regime, has increased its oil exports to China, undermining U.S. leverage. And now, with Venezuela's oil back on the market, they can at least say they're doing something. Even if that something is surrender. Second, geopolitics. Because this isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the bigger the struggle for influence in Latin America, the contest between the US and China for global energy dominance, and the slow but steady erosion of American power. And that's where things get really interesting. The extant geopolitical how Venezuela became a battleground. Let me take you back to 2013. Hugo Chavez has just died. Nicolas Maduro, his hand-picked successor, takes over. The US sees an opportunity. Venezuela is a mess economically, politically, socially. The Obama administration, fresh off the success of the Iran nuclear deal, thinks it can apply the same sanctions, isolation, and eventual negotiation. But there's one problem. This isn't Iran. Iran is a regional power with deep historical ties to Russia and China, but it's also a pariah in its own neighborhood. Venezuela? It's in America's backyard. The Monroe Doctrine, the idea that the Western Hemisphere is off-limits to foreign powers, has been the cornerstone of U.S. policy for 2 centuries. And yet, by the time Trump took office, Venezuela had become a client state of Russia and China. How did that happen? Simple. The U.S. overplayed its hand. When Obama first imposed sanctions, he did it cautiously. But Trump? He went all in. Full embargo. Secondary sanctions on anyone who did business with Venezuela. The goal was to strangle Maduro's regime. Instead, it pushed Venezuela into the arms of America's rivals. Russia saw an opportunity. In 2019, as U.S. sanctions tightened, Putin sent in Wagner Group mercenaries to protect Venezuela's oil fields. Why? Because Russia doesn't care about democracy. It cares about leverage. And a Venezuela dependent on Russian security is a Venezuela that can't be controlled by the U.S. China saw an even bigger opportunity. Venezuela owes China over $60 billion. Most of that debt is paid back in oil. So when U.S. sanctions cut off Venezuela's traditional markets, China stepped in. Today, nearly half of Venezuela's oil exports go to China. And it's not just oil. China has invested billions in Venezuelan infrastructure, from ports to telecommunications. In 2023, Maduro even announced that Venezuela would adopt China's digital currency, the digital yuan, for some transactions, a direct challenge to the US dollar's dominance. And then there's Iran. Another sanctioned regime, another US adversary. In 2020, as Venezuela's refineries collapsed, Iran sent in technicians and spare parts to keep them running. In return, Venezuela sent Iran gold. Not oil, gold. because oil is too easy to track. Gold is portable, untraceable, and perfect for evading sanctions. So here's the US tried to isolate Venezuela, and instead, it created a coalition of the sanctioned. Russia, China, and Iran, three of America's biggest adversaries, now have a foothold in the Western Hemisphere. And the Biden administration's decision to lift sanctions? That's not a victory. It's an admission of defeat. But here's where it gets even more dangerous. Because this isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the broader contest for global influence. And the US is losing. The military and strategic why this matters more than you think. Now, let me be clear. I'm not one of those armchair generals who thinks every foreign policy setback requires a military response. I've seen what happens when the US overreaches. Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya. We've spent trillions, lost thousands of lives, and for what? More instability, more terrorism, more chaos. But that doesn't mean we should ignore the military implications of what's happening in Venezuela. Because if you think this is just about oil, you're missing the bigger picture. Venezuela is a strategic chokepo. It sits on the northern coast of South America, just 1,500 miles from Miami. It has deep water ports that can accommodate Russian and Chinese naval vessels. And it's a launchpad for influence across Latin America, a region where the US has historically dominated, but where China is now making inroads. Let's talk about Russia first. In 2020, two Russian Tu-160 strategic bombers landed in Venezuela. They weren't there for a friendly visit. They were sending a weakened project power into your hemisphere. The US scrambled jets in response. But here's those bombers didn't come alone. They were accompanied by Russian military advisors, intelligence operatives, and, according to some reports, nuclear-capable missiles. Now, I'm not saying Russia is about to put nukes in Venezuela. But the fact that they can fly bombers there, refuel, and return to Russia without being intercepted? That's a problem. Because it shows that the US no longer has unchallenged air superiority in its own backyard. Then there's China. In 2023, China and Venezuela signed a military cooperation agreement. The details are classified, but we know it includes joint exercises, arms sales, and most worryingly, access to Venezuelan ports. China already has a military base in Djibouti. It's building one in Cambodia. And it's been in talks with Cuba about establishing a presence there. Venezuela would be the next logical step. Why does this matter? Because if China establishes a permanent military presence in Venezuela, it changes the balance of power in the Western Hemisphere. Suddenly, the US has to worry about Chinese submarines in the Caribbean, Chinese surveillance ships off the coast of Florida, and Chinese missiles within striking distance of American cities. And let's not forget Iran. In 2022, the US seized a shipment of Iranian weapons bound for Venezuela. The cargo included missiles and drones. Why would Iran send weapons to Venezuela? Because it's a way to project power into the Western Hemisphere without having to cross the Atlantic. And because Venezuela, like Iran, is a sanctioned regime that sees the US as an enemy. So when the Biden administration lifts sanctions on Venezuela, it's not just about oil. It's about legitimizing a regime that is actively working with America's adversaries. It's about sending a message to Russia, China, and you can operate in our hemisphere, and we won't stop you. And that's a message that will have consequences. The domestic political why this is about more than foreign policy. Now, let's talk about the elephant in the politics. Because this decision wasn't made in a vacuum. It was made in an election year, with a president who is trailing in the polls and a Democratic Party that is desperate to avoid another 2016-style defeat. Let's start with the obvious. Gas prices. They're not as high as they were in 2022, but they're still a political liability. The average American doesn't care about Venezuela's oil reserves. They care about how much it costs to fill up their tank. And if the Biden administration can point to a policy that might lower prices, even if it's a long shot, they'll take it. But there's more to it than that. Florida. The swing state. The one with 30 electoral votes and a large Venezuelan American community. For years, the conventional wisdom was that Venezuelan Americans who fled Maduro's regime would vote Republican. And for the most part, they have. But the Biden administration is betting that by easing sanctions, they can peel off some of that support. Maybe not enough to win Florida, but enough to make a difference in a close election. Then there's the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. They've been pushing for a more humane foreign policy, less intervention, more diplomacy. And while most Americans don't care about the nuances of Venezuela policy, the progressive base does. By lifting sanctions, Biden can say he's listening to them, even if the policy is a failure. But here's the problem. None of this actually helps the Venezuelan people. And it certainly doesn't help America's long-term interests. Because what the Biden administration is doing is classic short-term thinking. They're making a tactical move to win an election, without considering the strategic consequences. And those consequences? They're severe. Scenario: what comes next? So where does this go from here? Let's game out the possibilities. Because none of them are good. Scenario 1, the best case scenario. In this scenario, the lifting of sanctions actually works. Venezuela increases oil production, global prices drop, and Maduro, flush with cash, finally agrees to hold free and fair elections. The opposition wins, Maduro steps down, and Venezuela transitions to democracy. Now, I've been studying Venezuela for decades. And I can tell you with near certainty that this is not going to happen. Maduro has no intention of giving up power. He's seen what happened to Gaddafi, to Saddam, to Noriega. He knows that if he loses, he'll end up in The Hague or worse. So he'll rig the next election, just like he rigged the last one. And the US will be back where it started, with no leverage and a regime that is even more entrenched. Scenario 2, the most likely scenario. In this scenario, the sanctions relief gives Maduro just enough breathing room to consolidate power. He uses the new oil revenue to buy off the military, reward loyalists, and crush dissent. The opposition is marginalized. The US loses what little leverage it had. And Venezuela becomes a permanent client state of Russia and China. Meanwhile, gas prices don't drop. Because Venezuela's oil production is still crippled by years of mismanagement. And even if it does increase, China and India will buy it up at a discount, leaving the US with the same global supply constraints. The result? The US looks weak. Maduro looks strong. And America's adversaries gain a foothold in the Western Hemisphere. Scenario 3, the worst-case scenario. This is the scenario that keeps me up at night. In this version, the lifting of sanctions doesn't just fail, it backfires. Maduro, emboldened by his newfound legitimacy, doubles down on repression. The opposition is crushed. The military fractures. And Venezuela collapses into full-blown civil war. Now, you might think that's a problem for Venezuela. But it's not. Because a civil war in Venezuela means mass migration. Millions of refugees flooding into Colombia, Brazil, and, eventually, the US. It means a humanitarian crisis on America's doorstep. And it means a power vacuum that Russia, China, and Iran will rush to fill. We've seen this movie before. Syria. Libya. Afghanistan. The US thinks it can manage the chaos. But it can't. Because once the genie is out of the bottle, it's almost impossible to put back in. And here's the if this happens, the US will have no good options. Military intervention? Politically toxic. More sanctions? They've already failed. Diplomacy? Maduro won't negotiate. So what's left? Nothing. Just a slow-motion disaster that plays out in real time, with America watching from the sidelines. Grand strategy: the death of liberal hegemony. So what does all this mean for America's grand strategy? Because this isn't just about Venezuela. It's about a much bigger, the unsustainable nature of American global dominance. For the past 30 years, the US has operated under a doctrine of liberal hegemony. The idea that America can and should shape the world in its own image. Democracy promotion. free markets, human rights. And when those things don't take hold naturally, well, we'll just impose them. Through sanctions, through military force, through economic coercion. But here's the problem. The world has changed. And America's ability to enforce its will has not kept pace. Look at the last 2 decades. Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, Yemen. In each case, the US intervened with the best of intentions. And in each case, the result was chaos. Not because America is evil, but because the world is complex. And no amount of military power can force a society to change in ways it doesn't want to. Now, I'm not saying the US should retreat into isolationism. That would be just as dangerous. But what? What I am saying is that America needs to recalibrate its approach, not abandon its leadership, but recognize the limits of its power. The era of liberal hegemony is over, not because the ideals behind it were wrong, but because the tools we've relied on to enforce it are broken. Sanctions don't work when the target has alternative patrons. Military force doesn't stabilize, it accelerates fragmentation. And democracy promotion, as noble as it sounds, often backfires when it's perceived as regime change in disguise. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just a failure of execution, it's a failure of imagination. The foreign policy establishment in Washington still operates on the assumption that if we just apply enough pressure, the world will bend to our will. But the reality is that the 21st century has given rise to a multipolar order where America is no longer the sole arbiter of global outcomes. And Venezuela is the perfect case study in why that matters. Let me explain why this matters beyond Caracas. Because Venezuela isn't just a country, it's a node in a much larger geopolitical network. And if the US loses influence there, the ripple effects will be felt across the Western Hemisphere, with serious military and strategic consequences. First, there's the question of Russian and Chinese basing rights. We already know that both countries have been deepening their military cooperation with Maduro's regime. In 2019, Russia sent nuclear-capable bombers to Venezuela in a show of force. In 2022, China and Venezuela signed a $4 billion defense cooperation agreement, including joint military exercises. And just last year, reports emerged that Iran was helping Venezuela build a drone factory, potentially giving Tehran a forward operating base just 1,500 miles from Miami. Now, you might so what? The US has bases all over the world. Why can't Russia or China have a few in Venezuela? Here's the uncomfortable because geography matters. A Russian or Chinese military presence in Venezuela would give them a foothold in America's near abroad, just as Cuba did during the Cold War. It would allow them to project power into the Caribbean, threaten US shipping lanes, and most critically, complicate America's ability to defend its southern flank in a major conflict. Second, there's the issue of narco-trafficking and transnational crime. Venezuela has already become a hub for cocaine smuggling, with the regime itself implicated in the trade. If the country collapses into civil war, that pipeline will only grow. And where does that cocaine go? Into the hands of Mexican cartels, which then funnel it into the US market. We're not just talking about a humanitarian crisis, we're talking about a national security threat. The Pentagon has already warned that Mexican cartels are using military-grade weapons, including drones and anti-tank missiles, some of which are sourced from Venezuela. A failed state on America's doorstep doesn't just mean refugees, it means a direct conduit for drugs, weapons, and instability. Third, there's the broader erosion of US credibility. Every time America draws a red line and then fails to enforce it, its deterrence weakens. In 2019, the Trump administration recognized Juan Guaidó as Venezuela's legitimate president and threatened military action if Maduro didn't step down. Maduro called the bluff. The US blinked. Now, 4 years later, Guaidó is in exile, Maduro is still in power, and America's allies in the region are quietly hedging their bets. Colombia, once a stalwart US partner, has already started normalizing relations with Caracas. Brazil, under Lula, has made it clear it won't follow Washington's lead on Venezuela. And even Mexico, which has its own reasons to distrust Maduro, is more interested in managing the crisis than solving it. Here's the credibility isn't just about words, it's about consequences. When the US says it will do something and then doesn't, adversaries take note. China sees it. Russia sees it. Iran sees it. And they adjust their strategies accordingly. If America can't enforce its will in its own hemisphere, why should anyone believe it can do so in the South China Sea or the Taiwan Strait? Now, some will argue that the US doesn't need to intervene militarily in Venezuela, that we can contain the fallout through diplomacy and economic pressure. And to a certain extent, that's true. But containment only works if you have the leverage to make it stick. And right now, the US doesn't. Because the real power in Venezuela isn't in Washington, it's in Moscow, Beijing, and Tehran. Let me give you an example. In 2020, the US imposed secondary sanctions on companies doing business with Venezuela's oil sector. The goal was to choke off Maduro's revenue. And for a while, it worked. Venezuela's oil production plummeted from 3 million barrels per day in 1998 to just 700,000 in 2020. But then something unexpected happened. China and Russia stepped in. Beijing became Venezuela's largest creditor, lending Caracas over $60 billion since 2007. Moscow sent in Rosneft to help revive the oil industry. And Iran sent in tankers full of gasoline and technicians to repair Venezuela's refineries. Today, Venezuela's oil production is back up to 1.2 million barrels per day. Not great, but enough to keep the regime afloat. The lesson here is that sanctions only work if the target has no alternatives. And in today's world, America's adversaries have built an entire parallel financial system to circumvent US pressure. Russia has SPFS. China has CIPS. Iran has the Hawala system. And they're all designed to do one: insulate their economies from American coercion. So where does that leave the US? If military intervention is off the table, if sanctions are ineffective, and if diplomacy is a dead end, what's the play? The answer, I think, is to stop pretending we can control outcomes in Venezuela and start focusing on managing the consequences. That means working with regional partners to secure borders, interdict drug shipments, and prepare for mass migration. It means accepting that Maduro isn't going anywhere and finding ways to engage with his regime without legitimizing it. And it means recognizing that America's influence in Latin America is waning and that we need to adapt to that reality rather than clinging to the illusion of hegemony. But here's the bigger: if America can't even handle Venezuela, what does that say about its ability to handle the rest of the world? Because the challenges we're facing in Caracas are the same ones we're facing in Kiev, Taipei, and Tehran. A rising China. A resurgent Russia. A defiant Iran. And an America that's still trying to play by the rules of the 20th century in a 21st century world. The uncomfortable truth is that the US is no longer the sole superpower. It's still the most powerful country on earth, but its dominance is contested. And if we don't adjust our strategy to reflect that reality, we're going to keep losing face, not just in Venezuela, but everywhere. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just a foreign policy failure, it's a domestic political time bomb. The Biden administration inherited a Venezuela policy that was already in shambles, but instead of admitting defeat and pivoting, they've doubled down on the same tired playbook. Why? Because in Washington, admitting failure is political suicide. The establishment would rather cling to the illusion of control than risk looking weak in an election year. Let me explain why this matters for American voters. The sanctions regime against Venezuela has been in place since 2017, with Trump's maximum pressure campaign escalating in 2019. By 2020, the US had imposed over 400 sanctions targeting everything from oil exports to gold mining. The stated goal? To force Maduro out. The actual result? A humanitarian catastrophe that sent over 7 million Venezuelans fleeing the country, many of them ending up in Florida, Texas, and New York. And here's those migrants are now a political football in the 2024 election, with Republicans blaming Biden for the border crisis while Democrats insist the sanctions are working. But are they? Let's look at the numbers. In 2018, before the full weight of US sanctions hit, Venezuela's oil production was at 1.5 million barrels per day. By 2020, it had collapsed to 500,000. Today, as I mentioned earlier, it's back up to 1.2 million. That's not a victory for sanctions, that's a failure of economic warfare. And yet, the Biden administration keeps pretending that if we just squeeze a little harder, Maduro will crack. It's like trying to put out a fire by pouring gasoline on it. Here's the uncomfortable: the U.S. foreign policy establishment is stuck in a Cold War mindset. They see Venezuela as a domino that must not fall to socialism, when in reality, it's already fallen and the rest of Latin America is watching. Take Brazil, for example. Lula, who was once a darling of the American left, has made it clear that he's not interested in isolating Venezuela. In fact, he's been openly critical of U.S. sanctions, calling them ineffective and inhumane. That's not because Lula loves Maduro, it's because he understands that Latin America's future isn't going to be dictated by Washington anymore. And then there's Mexico. AMLO, another leftist leader, has refused to recognize Juan Guaido as Venezuela's legitimate president, despite U.S. pressure. Why? Because he knows that Mexico's own sovereignty is at stake. If the U.S. can unilaterally decide who runs Venezuela, what's to stop it from doing the same in Mexico? This is the real fear driving Latin American politics right now, not communism, not socialism, but the erosion of their own autonomy. So what does this mean for U.S. domestic politics? For starters, it means that the Venezuela issue is going to keep bleeding into the immigration debate. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis has already made Venezuela a centerpiece of his campaign, framing it as a cautionary tale about socialism and weak borders. Meanwhile, Democrats are caught between defending Biden's sanctions policy and trying to distance themselves from the humanitarian fallout. Neither side has a real solution, because the truth is, there isn't one, not one that fits neatly into a 30-second campaign ad, anyway. Let me give you a scenario projection. By the end of 2024, Venezuela's oil production will likely hit 1.5 million barrels per day, thanks to Russian and Iranian help. Maduro will still be in power, and the U.S. will still be pretending that sanctions are working. The border crisis will worsen, with more Venezuelans arriving in the U.S. seeking asylum. And the political fallout will be brutal. Republicans will hammer Biden for losing Venezuela, while Democrats will struggle to explain why their policy has failed so spectacularly. But here's the: this isn't just about Venezuela. It's about the broader collapse of America's post-Cold War dominance. The U.S. has spent the last 30 years acting like it can reshape the world in its image, only to find that the world has moved on. China is now the largest trading partner for most of Latin America. Russia is back as a major player in the region. And the U.S.? It's stuck playing whack-a-mole with sanctions that don't work and military threats that no one believes. So what's the way forward? I'll tell you what: it's more of the same. The U.S. needs to accept that Maduro isn't going anywhere and start engaging with his regime on practical issues: migration, drug trafficking, energy security, without legitimizing his authoritarianism. It needs to work with regional partners like Brazil and Mexico to stabilize the situation, rather than trying to dictate outcomes. And most importantly, it needs to stop pretending that sanctions are a magic bullet. They're not. They never were. The real question is whether Washington has the humility to admit that. Because if it doesn't, we're going to keep seeing the same sanctions, failure, denial, and more sanctions. And in the meantime, America's influence in its own backyard will continue to erode. That's not just a foreign policy problem, it's a domestic one. Because when the U.S. loses face in Venezuela, it loses credibility everywhere. And in a world where credibility is currency, that's a debt we can't afford to keep paying. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just a failure of policy, it's a failure of grand strategy. The U.S. has spent the better part of 3 decades operating under the assumption that economic pressure, diplomatic isolation, and the occasional military intervention could force regimes like Maduro's to bend to Washington's will. But that playbook was written in the 1990s, when the U.S. stood unchallenged as the world's sole superpower. Today, the game has changed. The rise of China as a financial and technological powerhouse, Russia's resurgence as a disruptive force, and the fragmentation of global governance into competing blocs have turned what was once a unipolar world into something far messier. And yet, Washington still acts as if the old rules apply. Let me explain why this matters beyond Venezuela. The US has long treated Latin America as its backyard, a sphere of influence where it could call the shots without serious pushback. But that assumption is now being tested in real time. Look at in 2000, the US accounted for 55% of Latin America's total trade. By 2023, that share had fallen to just 32%, while China's had surged from 2% to 18%. Russia, meanwhile, has reinserted itself as a key arms supplier and energy partner, with trade between Moscow and the region hitting $20 billion in 2023, double what it was a decade ago. And it's not just trade. China's Belt and Road Initiative has poured over $150 billion into Latin American infrastructure since 2017, while the US has struggled to offer anything beyond moralizing lectures about democracy and free markets. Here's the uncomfortable: the US is no longer the only game in town, and its refusal to adapt is costing it dearly. The Venezuela debacle is just the most visible symptom of a broader strategic myopia. Washington still thinks in terms of zero-sum competition: if Maduro wins, we lose; if China gains influence, we must counter it with sanctions or military posturing. But that's not how the world works anymore. The reality is that most Latin American countries don't want to choose between the US and China. They want to trade with both, take loans from both, and play both sides to their advantage. And who can blame them? When the US offers them nothing but lectures and sanctions, while China offers investment and Russia offers weapons, the choice isn't hard. So what are the alternatives? The first option is doubling down on the current approach: more sanctions, more isolation, more bluster about regime change. But as we've seen in Venezuela, Iran, and North Korea, this strategy doesn't work. It never has. Sanctions are a tool, not a policy, and when they're wielded as a substitute for diplomacy, they backfire. They strengthen hardliners, push target countries into the arms of US adversaries, and often hurt the very people Washington claims to be helping. In Venezuela, sanctions have contributed to an economic collapse that has driven over 7 million people to flee the country, creating a humanitarian crisis that now spills into the US itself. That's not a win. That's a self-inflicted wound. The second option is what I'll call pragmatic engagement, a recognition that the US can't dictate outcomes in Latin America anymore, but it can still shape them. This means accepting that Maduro isn't going anywhere in the short term and working with his regime on issues where interests migration, counter-narcotics, and energy security. It means toning down the rhetoric about democracy promotion and focusing instead on stabilizing the region. And it means working with partners like Brazil, Mexico, and Colombia not as junior allies, but as equals with their own agendas. Lula in Brazil has already made it clear that he won't follow Washington's lead on Venezuela. AMLO in Mexico has done the same. The US can either adapt to this new reality or keep pretending it can call the shots. The third option is the most fundamental rethink of US strategy in Latin America. Instead of treating the region as a battleground for great power competition, the US could focus on building a positive agenda, one that addresses the root causes of instability, like inequality, corruption, and weak institutions. That means investing in infrastructure, education, and public health, not just in counter-narcotics and military aid. It means offering Latin American countries a real alternative to China's Belt and Road, not just lecturing them about debt traps. And it means accepting that democracy, when it comes, will have to be homegrown, not imposed from Washington. But here's the: none of these alternatives are likely to happen under the current political climate in the US. The foreign policy establishment is too invested in the old playbook, and the domestic political incentives push toward confrontation, not cooperation. Republicans will keep hammering Biden for being soft on Maduro, while Democrats will keep pretending that sanctions are working. And the media will keep framing every development in Venezuela as a test of US resolve, rather than a complex geopolitical puzzle. That's how you get stuck in a cycle of failure where every setback is met with more of the same, and every crisis is treated as a morality play rather than a strategic challenge. Let me be: this isn't just about Venezuela. It's about whether the US can adapt to a world where it's no longer the undisputed hegemon. The Cold War is over. The unipolar moment is over. And yet, Washington still acts as if it can snap its fingers and make the world bend to its will. That's not leadership. That's delusion. And the longer the US clings to that delusion, the more it will find itself outmaneuvered, outflanked, and out of options. The real test isn't whether the US can win in Venezuela. It's whether it can accept that the game has changed and that the only way to stay relevant is to change with it. Because if it doesn't, the next Venezuela won't be in Latin America. It'll be closer to home. And by then, it might be too late.